next session entitled Unlocking Finance for Climate Resilient Innovation in Africa. Today we have an incredible panel. We've got Juliet Munro, Director of Digital Economy for FSD Africa. We have Maelis Carraro, Managing Director for the Catalyst Fund. Nick Hughes, Founder and CEO of CAVEX. And Jonathan First, Senior Consultant at CPI. I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, thanks and welcome to this session, and thank you very much to the Climate Resilience team for hosting us today. We really appreciate your hospitality. It's fantastic, and we think you've got one of the best pavilions in COP. So just to say that. So my name is Juliet, as Margot mentioned. I'm Director of Digital Economy at FSD Africa. We're a regional financial specialist organization headquartered in Nairobi, all about making finance work for Africa's future. We work across Africa. If you want to hear more about us, then come and see me afterwards, and I've got a number of colleagues that are here as well. So just before we start, I just wanted to get a sense from people here, whether there's anyone that wanted to say anything about why they're at this session. Does anyone have a particular interest? I'm just sort of understanding the motivation for being here, if anyone wants to say anything about what brought them to this session in the first place. Do you want to come in, if you can come and stand here?
Just out of curiosity, I was just passing by.
Okay, great. So hopefully the title is interesting, but I hope you all find it interesting. So we're really here to talk about unlocking finance for climate resilience innovation in Africa. And we all know that Africa is already facing significant impacts of climate change, and that looks set to increase over the years. A recent estimate shows that another 130 million people will be pushed into poverty as a result of climate change, which is not hard to imagine if you also think about the layering of compounded impacts of COVID and the war in Ukraine and rising debt and food prices and so on. So it's a pretty bleak picture. But we published some research quite recently in partnership with the Climate Policy Initiative, which estimated that Africa needs close to $280 billion worth of finance to flow in each year in order to help address these vulnerabilities. And that same research showed that perhaps only about 10% of that is coming into the continent, about 30 billion. And while Africa is perhaps better balanced in terms of some of that funding coming into for climate resilience and adaptation as opposed to mitigation, in absolute terms, there's a massive financing gap, and there's a need to really increase multifold the amount of climate finance that's coming in for adaptation. So in some ways, it's a pretty bleak financing picture that we're facing in Africa. And yet, on the other hand, there's a huge interesting investment opportunity here. I mean, I think as a continent, it presents a lot of assets that can be leveraged to bring finance and to help sort of invest. I think it's a very young population, very entrepreneurial, very dynamic, one that really led the mobile money revolution about a decade or so ago, and whose evolution in the digital economy is still continuing to evolve. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and there's a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators that are already starting to build solutions for climate resilience building amongst communities and businesses, leveraging both finance and technology in order to do so. So there's a lot of activity there. So it's a bit of a kind of bleak financial picture on the one hand, and a real opportunity for investors and for innovators on the other. So I think our challenge is to sort of dig a bit deeper and think about, well, what can we do to harness some of the investment that's already coming into the continent to fund early stage investment in climate resilient solutions on the one hand, but also how to attract more capital into Africa, given that there's such a significant gap happening. So that's really what we're trying to do with our, or scratch the surface with our panel today. So on that note, I'd like to introduce the panel. And I think, Margot, you already have, but Jonathan first is from the Climate Policy Initiative, and so was involved in the research that we just mentioned. Nick Hughes is a serial entrepreneur who has worked extensively in Africa over the years and is currently developing a solution that we'll hear more about. And Maelis Carraro, who has been in the investment world for many years, heading up the Catalyst Fund. So welcome to the panel. So if I could start with you, Jonathan, just really to sort of set the scene. I mean, this report of CPI was published last month. And the purpose of it is the first of its kind, really trying to sort of set a baseline for what the inflows of finance are, which kinds of organizations that finance is coming from, what kind of purpose that finance is being used for. So could you just sort of say a little bit more about what that landscape looks for, and particularly things that are relevant to our conversation today?
Thanks very much. So there was a lot of negatives in the report, as one can imagine, but I don't really want to dwell on the negatives. I really wanted to highlight where the advantages are, where the positives are that came out of the report, and how we can increase the amount of funding that comes into Africa, particularly around adaptation. Mitigation, as you know, is far easier to fund, and I'll go into that in a little more detail, but I think it's around adaptation that we're struggling at the moment. In fact, a CPI does this very complicated, well, it seems complicated, spaghetti analysis of climate flows into Africa, and it's actually in the report. And what it showed is that of the money coming into Africa, over 90% of it comes from public sector. In other words, not private sector. So we're talking about donor governments, that kind of thing, which is obviously quite alarming. So 20% of the 30 billion is only from the private sector. So that was something that was a little bit upsetting. The other thing that was a little bit upsetting was that mitigation makes up 70% and adaptation is only 30%. So I think those are our two challenges. Our challenge is, how do we get the adaptation closer to 50% at least? And how do we get that 20%, this is more important, up to far higher, in other words, closer to 60, 70%. So that's very much where the report, and the report is very much a first step, and hopefully, will be continuously updated. But as Juliet says, it is groundbreaking in that it's the first report of its kind, and thanks to FSD for supporting it, but it's the first of its kind where we have plotted climate flows into Africa. So the positives and the things that we really have to hang on to try and reverse or improve the situation is, number one, Africa is by nature very entrepreneurial. We are entrepreneurs in Africa. And I think that that's very important in terms of developing and identifying projects for financing. And the private sector, in my opinion, is what's going to solve the energy issues, the water issues in Africa. It's not going to be government. Okay? There are many reasons why, and I think we all know why, but it's going to be very much dependent on the private sector. And as we have all these entrepreneurs, to me that's a very positive, and that's what came out in the report. The second is, and this is very, very important, we need to deepen the local debt capital markets. We have to use local funding to increase the amount of money that's available for mitigation and adaptation. And in every African country, there are pension funds, there are asset managers, there are life companies, all of which have funds to invest. And very little of that money is actually invested in mitigation or adaptation type projects. So we need to create the environment where we can borrow locally, not always have to rely on foreign inflows into the country. So that was a second positive, is that the development of local debt capital markets. The third issue is we need to look at funding on a national and a regional basis. We can't look at Africa as a whole. So all funding, the approach to funding and innovation in funding needs to be very much national or regional specific. And I say that for the following reasons. There's two sort of statistics. The one is there are 54 countries in Africa. So Africa is not one country, as Sarah Palin once said. And secondly, of the 54 countries, only 3 are investment grade. Okay, so you can't expect investment flows if there is no investment grade. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's an impediment. I'm just saying that we have to look at it very differently, far more of a project finance approach. So that was another very important aspect. The next one, the fourth reason, was we need to look at specific financial instruments. And we have to match those instruments according to the barriers. And I can give 3 examples. The one is guarantees. We don't have enough guarantees. Guarantees solves currency risk, convertibility risk, and availability risk. We do not see enough guarantees. So there has to be a development of funding towards guarantees. The next one is outcomes-based funding. So there are a lot of investors that are skeptical. And so if you make it outcomes-based, you remove the skepticism. So by saying we will achieve A, B, and C, and then achieving A, B, and C, you will get funding. Okay, and we're starting to see a lot more of outcomes-based funding. And the third is carbon finance. And I think Nick's going to go into that in a bit more detail. But that offers enormous opportunity. And I think the problem is we didn't understand carbon finance until very recently. So we're all scared of it. But I think that the development, the pace at which it's moving, carbon finance becomes a real opportunity to provide innovative funding to Africa and particularly to impact-related projects. Now, where government can play a role, so it's not as though we're on our own here as far as the private sector is concerned, or as far as the private sector funders are concerned, where governments can play a role is in policy and regulatory reform and support. That is very, very important. If governments do nothing else but provide the enabling environment for investment, they've achieved everything that we'll need. And that was the other point that came out in the report. So those are areas, very high level, very summarized at this stage, where we believe, where the report identified how we can increase, and when I mean increase the amount of funding available for adaptation, and secondly, increase the amount of private sector investment. One last point, I just want to talk about why we see so little in adaptation versus mitigation. It's for 2 reasons. The one is we talk about cash generation, project cash generation. Unfortunately, a renewable energy project has more certainty around cash flows than perhaps a wastewater treatment plant project. And debt, if it's concessional, if it's commercial, needs to be repaid. And you only repay it from the cash flows from the project. So that's one of the reasons why we see adaptation falling behind mitigation. And the second, of course, is this, and we discuss it at every conference, on every panel, we're just not seeing enough of investable projects. Okay, and I think we can all talk about that for days on end. So those are the sort of 2 big reasons why adaptation is not where mitigation is. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And you've touched on a number of points that we're going to come back to. And I think one point there is around innovation required for financing itself, as well as innovation investment into other kinds of solution building. So Maelis, I'm going to turn to you. You're an investor that's been investing in climate resilience. You've been investing in resilience for a number of years, and now you're turning your attention even more so to climate resilience innovation. So you've heard a bit about the CPI report. I know you've read it. I just wonder whether it rings true. I mean, how does it compare to what you're seeing on the ground as an investor in Africa?
Absolutely. It certainly does ring true, pretty much all the points that Jonathan well summarized. And for us as an investor focused primarily on climate adaptation and resilience, these issues are really concrete. Like the fact that there isn't enough capital going to adaptation and resilience means that there isn't enough flow to support existing ventures, whether they're bankable or not, we're getting into that, but like those that are already there, there's not enough flow of capital supporting the emergence of new solutions that are needed, and there's not enough support for investors to come after we invest, because we invest very early stage. And in addition, coming back to also some of the points you made, it also means that there's a huge gap, certainly, because actually earlier today I heard somebody saying the adaptation gap is $550 billion, so we have to move fast, but also an opportunity, meaning that it is a space, for lack of a better word, a green space that requires more investors to take the risk, to back initiatives, even in absence of concrete proof points. And that is what I hope we, as an early stage investor, can fill as a gap, right? So Catalyst Fund actually was born with a mandate to be the first investors into early stage startups. We're talking pre-seed startups, usually the first institutional investors into the companies, and provide capital, but also very hands-on and bespoke venture building support, so technical support, business development support, fundraising support, and the like to cover all of the functions that startups really need at the early stage. And with that approach, de-risk those initiatives and attract more capital into climate adaptation and resilience. We did it in the financial inclusion sector, it certainly worked, and now we want to do it again in the climate resilience sector. So that, I think, is what we need at the early stage as an approach to attract more investors, to fill the capital gap, and make those startups bankable and investable. Because they are out there, it's not that they're not, they just need a little bit extra support from the ecosystem at the early stage of their journeys.
Great, thanks, Maelis. Just staying on that point. So you're at the point where you're raising at least $25 million for an Africa fund to support climate resilient solutions. So you're convinced of the business opportunity yourself. I just want you to say a little bit more about that, and really linking to that point that Jonathan made about the lack of investable projects. Can you just sort of elaborate on that little, the pipeline problem?
Absolutely.
We hear about this pipeline problem. What do you say about that?
So I do think that, generally speaking, compared to other sectors, especially if you compare to fintech or even renewable energy sector, there are less solutions out there that you could clearly classify as a climate adaptation resilient solutions. That also is because in the sector generally, we don't have the labels, and the universe of solutions in adaptation is very broad. We, for example, look at solutions in agri-tech, regen ag, aquaculture, fishery management, but also carbon finance marketplaces that could be a source of income for those startups and their customers and users downstream. So it's quite a broad universe of solutions out there that you need to identify and understand how is this going to contribute to climate adaptation and resilience outcomes. And I think in the sector there is a lack of language and measurement also, standards to really define what this is. So that's one point. But that said, we are seeing actually in pipeline today, over the past 6 months, we needed to make 10 investments. We scoured at least 3,000 companies, of which 1,000 made it to like a short list, because we believe that there was a climate adaptation and resilience impact. Yet all of them clearly were at the very beginning, right, of their path to growth, needed that first capital in, needed that additional support, needed the connection to ecosystem stakeholders to enable their grow and scale. So I think it's less perhaps about a full lack of pipeline and more about its early days in the ecosystem. So we need to invest more and be patient also to see the evolution of these ventures and how they will become more investable over time. But from an opportunity perspective, this is why we're in it today. Like, we're in it today because it's early. We're going to be the first one in. The demand for resilience and adaptation products, it's only going to skyrocket. The agriculture sector is going to be worth $1 trillion in Africa alone, right? So we're talking about a massive economic opportunity, a massive impact opportunity, and we want to be the first ones in. So clearly, from an investment perspective, I think there's no question. that there's a huge opportunity here.
Great, thank you. And I just wonder, before I hand over to you, Nick, whether you could also say something a bit about the kind of spectrum of mitigation versus climate resilience. We're talking about climate resilience and adaptation here, and we talk about mitigation almost as if it's something different. But I wonder if you could say something about what you're seeing in the pipeline, about the sort of coming together of those two issues, and the sort of impact that we expect to see from some of those solutions.
I think sometimes the hard differentiation of both outcomes is actually not helpful. And we see a lot in the startups that we're looking at and that we're about to invest in dual benefits, both on mitigation outcomes as well as adaptation and resilience outcome. Give you a clear example. For example, we're looking at a company in the biochar space where you both have a carbon sequestration and reduction of CO2 outcome, as well as regeneration of soil, better, obviously, outcome from an agricultural yield, which translates to higher incomes for farmers. So you have the whole spectrum of resilience, nature resilience, financial resilience, which we can classify under adaptation, as well as reduction of CO2, which is a mitigation outcome and more easily measurable. So there are those projects out there that actually achieve both. And as an investor, we don't think the distinction is that helpful, but our first lens is certainly, is there an adaptation outcome? Yes. Is there a mitigation outcome? Great. And there's often, it's often both. And that's how we've been looking at it.
Great, thank you. So Nick, and just by the way, we were hoping to get at least a couple of other innovators on our panel, but they had green zone passes. They didn't have blue zone passes, so we couldn't get them in, unfortunately. But we've got Nick, who is a seasoned entrepreneur who has been innovating in Africa for many years and was really part of that sort of mobile money revolution that I referred to earlier, really sort of helping found M-Pesa, which was building the rails of digital payments in Africa. So coming with a lot of experience, and then moving on to the Internet of Things, really within COPA, sort of bringing digital finance into sort of renewable energy and access to that. Now Nick's on his latest venture, which is Cavix. So I just want you to tell us a little bit more about this venture, Nick.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. Just on this point about pipeline, you also do need entrepreneurs who can see the opportunity, can sense there's some investment opportunity there as well, can see the need in the marketplace. I didn't hear John Kerry's speech yesterday. I was traveling down, but apparently he was saying something. I'm going to sort of make up what he said, but he said something like, "If I was a young man now, I'd be setting up a climate tech business," because all the signals are there that we should be moving much more aggressively into this. So if you've got an entrepreneurial spirit, this is going to be a big space. I know we've got a funding gap, and I know we've got to think about how we bridge ideas into scale. But I'm an optimist. I think we've got some fantastic tools at our disposal to make this work. And so, let me tell you a little bit about Cavix, which stands for Carbon Value Exchange Company. I'm going to make some assumptions that people here are familiar with the carbon markets. They're a beautiful economic idea. They're actually very hard to put into practice. The idea is some companies can save carbon, reduce carbon, or eliminate it. They can sell credits against the baseline back to somebody who can't quite hit their targets. Now, a few things have happened in the last few years that have really made this market come alive. We've jumped from a 1 billion market to a 2 billion market over the last 24 months. We've seen an average price of carbon bump along for a long time at about less than $1. It's now up at $4 last year on average. In the compliance markets, you're getting much higher prices too. So carbon markets are starting to work, but we are still leaving a vast number of projects off the table. We haven't found a way to help smaller companies get into that carbon space yet. And yet we've got lots of things we can do now. We've got digital technology where I can remotely monitor things almost anywhere on the planet now. I can be under a GSM network. I can look at a solar irrigation pump, or I can monitor some coal storage in the food chain, or I can measure above ground biomass in a small plantation. If I can get that data, I can pull that to the cloud. I can get auditors to look at the data rather than go out and do the sort of old-fashioned over-the-counter project-by-project auditing. Let's use data to create carbon credits and then trigger links to buyers of carbon credits. And in the voluntary markets, we've seen nearly 40% of the global 500 companies now set net zero targets. So you've got buy-side demand as well. You've got large companies like Microsoft and Unilever and others are leading the way, saying we want to eliminate, we're net zero by 2030, 2035. We're going to do everything we can to reduce our emissions, but we might need to buy credits. And so we have this demand signal from the markets that credits are attractive to organizations, the price is going to go up. We just need to find a way to bring smaller projects in. And that's really what we're doing with CAVEX, with some FSD support. We've built a prototype platform. We are using data to remotely monitor activities. We're allowing buyers to come into a portal and look at the very source of the data, so they can see the data that generate the credit. None of this over-the-counter broker deals that happen at the moment. It's a much more efficient marketplace. Yeah, and we think it's got a big opportunity. There's no shortage on either side of that equation. Buyers of credits or smaller projects which want to sell their data to monetize their carbon credits.
And we're at the Climate Justice Pavilion, so what's the climate justice angle here? I mean, we're really talking about democratizing climate finance. Yeah. And so can you just say a bit more about the kinds of projects that are going to benefit from the platform that you're creating?
Yeah, sure. So they can be, well, there's a whole range. There's carbon sequestration or sinks. We were talking earlier about locking up in carbon in soil. There's biochar examples. There's clean cook stoves which displace charcoal. There's solar irrigated water pumps that save time and money over the longer term on farms. These are lots and lots of projects that create a carbon benefit, but have not yet found a way to be monetized. But let's use technology to do that. This is the weird thing about the carbon markets. You know, if I'm in the UK, I live in the UK, and let's say I want to offset my travel into London and it's about half a kilo's worth of carbon. I can't buy half a kilo's worth of carbon, but if I could pay £1 to buy that. £1 to me is nothing. I feel good because I'm offsetting my journey. £1, if I can get it down to the M-Pesa account of a smallholder farmer and turn it into a 1,000 shillings or 100 shillings or something in his wallet or her wallet, that's real money. So we actually have this, I think, this amazing opportunity to get sort of a little bit more global parity on the price of a ton of carbon. And big companies are paying good money for carbon credits at the moment. Let's find ways to get that hard currency down to projects. And that's exactly what we're doing in CAVEX. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, no, very, very, very interesting. And just sort of thinking about the financing angle. I mean, obviously, I know you're an optimist, Nick, which is great. But how are you approaching the financing? You're at the stage where you're building something. You're going to be looking to scale it in a very short space of time. What do you see as your opportunities and your challenges from a fundraising perspective, thinking about the broader climate finance issue? Are you all right there?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've got some, thank you. I've done this a few times. As you know, M-Pesa, the history of M-Pesa, I started with a grant from UK government. If I hadn't had that grant, M-Pesa would never have existed. I'm on record for saying that. So we've followed something similar with CAVEX. We've had some grant funding, in fact, from FSD and FCDO. And it's great now that organisations like Catalyst are coming in with the right size tickets for their early stage. But there is this valley of death. You know, you've got to suddenly jump up to raising millions of dollars to get across that valley and get to scale. Because you can have a brilliant idea, but unless you can throw the right team at it, the right resources, bring on the right partners, many initiatives sort of die in that valley of going somewhere between 1 million and 5 million in a raised dollar. It's actually much harder to do, and that's why I think it's important we see that gap filled. But we are looking for a blended finance. We've got funders who are coming in and saying, look, we like what you're doing. We understand it's risky. We'll put some grant funds in, but there are also impact investors now, which didn't exist 20 years ago. And we can go to impact investors because we can see more than just the financial bottom line. We can, obviously everything we're talking about here, it's about impact. Yeah. It's about co-benefits from carbon, not just the carbon molecules themselves. It's women's economic empowerment, it's biodiversity. There's lots of reasons for it to appeal to an impact investor. So we are shooting for a $20 million raise now, and we're confident that we'll close that in the next 6 months, and that will be enough for us to go from prototype to scale.
Well, and just a last question for you, Nick, directly. Sorry, I'm hammering them at you, but you talked about your solution sort of helping to build transparency between the buyer of carbon credits and the producers of those credits. Can you also say something, again, thinking about the justice angle, you know, you're helping to sort of enable finance to reach people at the end mile and not get clogged up in some of this middle mile verification and all that side of things.
I'm going to give away my age now, but back in the 90s I worked for BP under Lord Brown, John Brown, and we started trading carbon 20 years ago because John Brown said we need to get up. That's when he rebranded BP into Beyond Petroleum, and he got hammered for it. But people were thinking about carbon trading 20 years ago. What's happened is nobody's taken account of what we can do digitally now. So this remote monitoring, the IoT, the satellite image capture, that's one big change. So that's helped us. We can now move relatively small amounts of money around. That's changed too. And it just feels to me that there's no reason why 40 to 60% of the proceeds from a carbon sale go out in the middle to the auditors and the verification bodies and the standards. That's crazy. In fact, I think if you're a big project or a big initiative, you can afford to spend a couple of $100,000, you can afford to take 2 years, you'd probably go for the gold standard verification. But that's leaving off the table all of these many smaller projects which could really benefit from that hard cash, that hard currency on a project.
Okay, great. Jonathan, back to you, and I think you touched on it in your initial scene setting, but how can we increase the flows of finance? How can we capture some of the finance that's already coming in or that's within Africa for this earlier stage innovation around climate resilience, and how can we increase the flows? What do we need to do?
I mean, that is a very difficult question. So, number one, the amount of money available needs to increase. And in my view, the only way it's going to increase is if the providers of that, let's call it grant funding for innovation, are convinced that there are projects to support. And I think that very much relies on an ability to create, for want of a better word, a sort of innovation hub or innovation enabling environment within the country. So for example, Nick is a perfect example. I mean, we need to create some form of enabling environment in the country or in the regions that will enable far more Nicks to be able to thrive. Because once we create that enabling environment, the experience, the good experience, the experience that, for example, the UK government, I have no doubt, boasts about how successful they've been by supporting you, that will become infectious. It really will be. So it's not a simple answer, but I think it has to rely less on the sort of hit and misses that Nick has had to do, and more about planning. In other words, how do we get these entrepreneurs? I'll give you an example. There's an organization called AGRA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with AGRA. So they are probably the largest agricultural network in Africa. They've got 60 networks in Africa. So their ability to identify pipeline is phenomenal. Okay? But where their challenge is at the moment is that they found quite a lot of money to back the innovators, okay? The entrepreneurs, when they get to a stage where the project can be invested in. But they are struggling to get the sort of the pipeline in its infancy to that stage. And I think that's where the opportunity is. The opportunity is to incubate and develop those tech entrepreneurs, those smallholder farmers, to get them to a place where they can be invested in. So it's not an easy answer, but I think we need to create some form of enabling environment within the country.
Well, and we often talk about inflows into Africa as if that investment has to come into Africa, but obviously there's a lot of investment already in Africa. So how do we capture that? You know, in the various private corporate companies, in pension funds, in other sources of capital. What's going to motivate those kinds of investors to invest in the continent?
I want to talk about a specific example. So there's a company called Sun Culture, which does an irrigation, a renewable energy-based irrigation system. And they've been very successful, not quite as successful as Nick. So they have, over the years, begged, borrowed, and not stolen money to develop their business. They are based in Kenya at the moment, and they're hoping to expand beyond Kenya. They have now built up a portfolio of the equivalent of $8 million. Okay. Now, so I met them actually at a conference, the AgriF conference. And I said to him, what's your biggest challenge? And they said, it's money. So currently, the way they fund themselves, which seems to be incredibly difficult, they have 6 banks. Okay, so you can imagine managing 6 banks that are lending you $8 million. I mean, this must be a nightmare. Okay, the interest rate is ridiculous in dollars. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's financed against inventory and receivables. So it's extremely difficult for them to grow the business as quickly as they like. I said to him, if you had money, okay, he said we could treble the size of our company. So what I'm proposing to them is something called a securitization structure, which I developed at the bank, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, where I was previously. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to use the local debt capital markets to refinance that portfolio. So effectively create an instrument which can be purchased once the systems are operating. And what was very interesting, I asked them, what's your non-payment? So they said before collections at about 15%, after collections it's about 6%. So I thought, right, what we'll do there is we'll put in a first loss, okay, which I know we can find, of 20%. So effectively, the private sector investors in those countries are taking, it's not a risk-free investment, but it's taking an investment where it's pretty certain that they're going to be repaid. And I believe by repeating this, okay, over and over again, it now comes back a far more effective way of funding the rollout of this technology. Okay, so that is just an example how we can use the debt capital markets and how we can increase investment in innovation.
Thanks, Jonathan. So again, innovating finance and financing innovation. Maelis, you're also involved in the broader ecosystem. What do you see as the important factors within that ecosystem?
Yeah, I was urging to jump in and comment on both of their points because there's so much that resonates in what you've said. I think it's certainly both about diversifying the kind of instruments that are available to finance this kind of innovation, as Jonathan rightly pointed out, whether it's innovation in equity structures or debt instruments or guarantees or refinancing, like that needs to certainly expand. There's, as you said, a need to also have way more capital at the earlier stages to really help ventures become investable, but even talking the right language with investors, because as you said, like the opportunity is massive, but sometimes how you define yourself as a climate venture is not obvious for entrepreneurs across the continent. That's what we're seeing, at least. But also the elephant in the room here that maybe I'll be a little provocative and say, like when it comes to blended finance and mobilizing this large financing, especially from development finance institution, multilaterals, and others, is speed. It is so slow to mobilize some of this capital. Like I'm fundraising and going to some of these actors and their answer is, well, if you're starting now, perhaps in 2025, we're going to be able to come in. How are we going to meet the financing gap of 550 billion if it takes 3 years to mobilize the structures? 3 years. But that's what we're talking about in the blended finance world, right? So I don't, if we really want to have creating a bridge, right, between the public finance, private financing, blending these sources of capital and meet the urgency. We also have to rethink the way that this capital moves and flows to these projects. Maybe rethink the way that due diligence happens and coordinate across all of these bodies and investors so it can be faster. And I think that is certainly a message I think this audience needs to hear today, on Finance Day, or otherwise we're not going to make it.
So on that note, I mean, a final question to all of you before we open it up for Q&A is what would you like to see coming out of COP that's really going to kind of move the needle in relation to what we've been talking about this afternoon?
Personally, I'd like to see not just commitments in terms of numbers. We're going to commit X trillion to, say, adaptation and resilience, but actually an agreement among the key actors here would be, again, the multilaterals or development finance institutions or even private investors to say, here's how we're going to go about it. Here's a collaborative we're setting up, maybe a common set of diligence structures, a common set of metrics to review initiatives proportionally, like from the earlier stage when you're taking greater risk to later stages where you can assess solutions more robustly, and say, with that, we commit to mobilize financing within 2 years, right, of this COP27. So that at COP29, we're not repeating the same messages and having the same conversations. Commitments are not enough, but we need action.
Great, thanks, Maelis. Same question to you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. I actually walked out of COP8 thinking I'm never going to go to it. When I was working for BP, I said I'm never going to go to another COP, but I've been back to 2 now. Look, business needs certainty. If we've got a little bit more certainty about some of the regulatory environments around, maybe some of the investor appetite for stepping in, that's what a business person wants. And then the worst thing for someone who's probably taking a big career decision to start a new business is the ground going to change under my feet? Are the rules of the market clear enough? And I think if we can get some more of that coming out of COP, especially around things, I know we've made a lot of progress last year around Article 6 on the carbon markets, but I think more certainty will encourage the private sector to step up and step in.
Great, thanks, Nick. Jonathan.
Yeah, I would like to see 2 things, I think. One is a far greater commitment in terms of grant funding to support entrepreneurs, to take projects from what we call feasibility to bankability. It's just not happening. It's really not happening. There's a lot of talk and absolutely no action. And the second is I'd really like to see a massive outcomes-based fund on the back of that. Because you're getting the projects and then there's no excuses. Okay? The project's operational. Now they've committed to certain outcomes for which they'll get rewarded, financially rewarded. But they've got to create those outcomes first. So, in Nick's case, I don't know, when he started, maybe, the outcome, his baseline was, I don't know, 20,000, whatever you call it, systems, whatever you call it. He would get paid on delivery of that. And there's no hiding, there's no excuses. If he doesn't get there, he doesn't get the money. But what it does for him is it improves the return of his investment. And then he can go out and do more and more. And it takes all the cynicism away from the investor. Because the investor doesn't have to part with their money until they've actually achieved the outcomes.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Margot, I can see you honing in there. Does that mean we haven't got time for questions?
We do have time for questions, so I'd like to start the queue over here. If there's anybody who has a question for our panelists, if you could come on over, please. I need you to stand right here in this pink X. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Sankita Conte. I am from Sierra Leone. I work with rural communities. Some of them are forest-based communities, and they're struggling to keep their forests. And so listening to the panel about unlocking finances, I was wondering what kind of message would I take back to those communities that are looking at ways of protecting their natural resources, but also making a living out of it. How does this finance get to those last-mile communities in far-flung rural areas to make a difference in their lives? That is something I'd like to hear from the panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for your question, which is an excellent one. I'm going to hand that to you, Nick.
Oh yeah, great. That is a really good question. And this is what I think we can do. Again, I'm going to put an optimistic layer on this, but trees, and I'm going to pinch a quote from John Mundy from One Acre Fund. He said, trees are the most patient capital you can get. These things, you put them in the ground or they're growing, and they have to be a mature tree before they lock up a ton of carbon. And a ton of carbon, let's say that'll be worth $30 in the next couple of years. We should be finding ways to get that $30 for one protected mature tree down to those communities. And that's exactly what we want to do in Cavex. And let's say you're a smallholder farmer and you've got a couple of thousand trees or even a couple of hundred trees. You can sort of build financial products around that longevity of that carbon, above ground biomass and the carbon being protected. So some can come as cash, but some could come as agri-inputs to help farmer foresters. And we know how to do that, and we've been doing that for years, building quite sophisticated financial products for low-income groups. There's nothing to stop us doing it and linking it to the asset that is the trees and the carbon and the biodiversity associated with it.
So there is an actual financial instrument that has been developed so CPI is the Secretariat for the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. Go onto their website. There are 58 instruments that have been developed through the lab, and I think at least one, maybe two, are directly related to what you're looking for. So basically, it's a financial instrument where the farmer is paid money upfront, and in return commits to the carbon credits once the tree reaches maturity. And yeah, absolutely. So they get the money up front, okay, to go and buy whatever they need to do, equipment, pay salaries, etc. But then the benefit from that tree vests with whoever funded that in the first place. So there's an actual instrument that's been developed, and it'll give the details of who the people are that developed it, and you can get in contact with them. I can't remember the name of it, but it's definitely on the website.
So Jonathan will give you his business card after the panel.
Thank you. It's well rehearsed. There's a spot I should sit here. So my name is Marcelo Furtado. I'm from Nature Finance. And I just wanted to make a provocation that the financial sector calls for certainty, calls for transparency, and so on. But when it comes to, for example, developing financial products that you see like subprimes or hyper trading, there is neither certainty nor assurance, and yet everybody invests on it. Then you come and say, let's invest in Africa or Latin America, and people say, oh, that's too risky. It's very high risk. So I think that we should also address a narrative of the financial sector, of how the financial sector sees investing in climate and nature. As another suggestion, I would say that we should not stick to only carbon. Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia, they have nature also with ecosystem services, water. And I think that what we should be looking at is actually nature credits, where you have the carbon plus. And for that, I do think we have another elephant in the room, which is governance. And I would like to hear a little bit from you. What are the elements of governance you imagine that one would require in Africa in order to make this an appealing investment? Thank you.
I mean, again, another brilliant question. Kelvin, I wanted to put you on the spot here because we're talking about broadening this from carbon to nature, and I know you're involved in nature-based disclosure initiative for financial institutions. I don't know if you want to say anything about this, but also whether anyone in the panel wants to tackle the governance issue here.
I'll just make one. I think it's a brilliant point. How can we complain about complexity when we look at what our city whiz kids have done for the last 20 years and built a house of cards, basically? And so a really good point. The challenge with the beautiful thing about carbon is it's science. You know how many grams of carbon are in a litre of diesel that's displaced. You know how you can calculate carbon stock from trees. It's good, solid science. So if we can digitalize it, that gives us a really hard anchor to sort of back up the carbon credit claim. You're absolutely right, though. There are these, of course, in the carbon markets, they call co-benefits. So, biodiversity is a big one. Women's economic empowerment's another one. How we quantify those to create a market is still, it's been a search for the Holy Grail. I remember, a long time ago, people trying to say, how do we quantify the taxonomy of a green company? And it gets really messy. And if it gets messy, and those sort of vacuums of knowledge leave space for people to come in with greenwash and that sort of rubbish. Whereas the beauty of the carbon market piece is it's just science. But look, I think it's a really good provocation, and it is a good point. It would be great if we can trade other assets, but the complexity of it shouldn't be underestimated, I think.
Great question, and I think the narrative is really important, and nature gives us an opportunity to change the narrative, because actually if you talk about natural capital, Africa is a superpower in the world, and many of the countries in Africa, like Gabon, would be the world superpowers. And if you think about net zero, many countries in Africa are actually net positive. And so we have this natural asset that really has an opportunity for us to leverage, to grow, and to deliver economic opportunity. And those assets can be monetized through the carbon markets. And so I think that's an important area that we need to develop. Africa has 30% of world's biodiversity on the continent. We've got the world's second largest rainforest. We are the lungs of the world as a continent. And so, that's a massive opportunity, and there's the risk can be mitigated, and we can, leverage it through the carbon markets to really deliver jobs, basic services, and economic opportunity.
Thanks for the question.
And we have time for one last question.
All right, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I really appreciate. My name is Akufuna Myunda from Zambia. Again, in relation to the point that kept coming, which is the justice aspect of the conversation, I just want to share a few pain points as a young person, but also most importantly that some of the answers you have given address some of my concerns. So one of the challenges that we face as young people, especially at the startup phase or even below that, is the eligibility criterion for such available financing that is there for us. You find that it takes you so much to do from the technicality perspective for you to get into the game. Therefore, we have a lot of innovations that die at a very young age. So the potential is there, and the willingness is there, the passion is there. That's why we fight so hard, even to find ourselves in such kind of spaces as young people. To just find accreditation, to just find financing, to come and attend such events is a hurdle on its own. It's a hard work on its own. Now, I've been running a small organization called Young Volunteers for Environment. I've re-registered it as a social enterprise, trying to address the sustainability aspect of it. But you find that we don't qualify to many of these available financing. So this conversation is very important to me because we're talking about unlocking that. And this is my pain point. My pain point is because other players have the capacity from the technical perspective, they end up being the same people benefiting from all these financing mechanisms all the time. Yet, in terms of impact, we see nothing on the ground. But because they meet all the requirements, they keep receiving this same financing, and that pains me as a youth activist for climate justice. Because now we see innovations dying and not being supported, whereas people, business as usual, they access financing to just keep giving reports and no impact on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and that's a very valid point. I mean, we see it a lot, and I think that's one reason why we need to harness finance for even earlier stage innovation to get the ideas off the ground in the first place, before then the early stage innovation, which is where Maelis comes in. And that's one of the reasons why I think organizations like Catalyst Fund is combining not just capital, but also venture building support to help with the whole sort of organization setup and the different types of technical assistance and sort of information and experience that's required to set up a business in the first place. It's not just about money. So very good point.
Thank you for raising that. It actually rings a very personal chord for me, because as a former entrepreneur myself, that was exactly like the kind of challenge that you face all the time. How do you access the universe? How do you actually unlock the opportunities, understand it even, right? And all the requirements. So I would say, to answer you, that number one, we need more of the early stage actors, like accelerators and early stage funds, to be able to deploy capital in a more flexible, quick, right way, and not get too bogged down into criteria, eligibility, making the application process for young entrepreneurs more complex than it should be. So that's certainly one thing that we're working on, as we want it to be the first quick capital into the businesses. And then, as Juliet pointed out, it's not just the money, right? It's everything else that comes with it. So as an entrepreneur, I encourage you to try to understand who brings value beyond money, to help map out the universe, help understanding when and how to fundraise and from whom. That's something that we do a lot with our entrepreneurs, because it's so vital, but not everybody offers it. So really spending time understanding what I'm going to get out of program X or investor X, before even spending your effort and time, because that's your most precious thing as an entrepreneur, it would be my recommendation.
Great, thank you, Margot and the Climate Justice Pavilion, Morgan, and everybody for hosting us.
Thank you so much. I'd just like you all to give a round of applause to our panelists today. This was an excellent session, and they'll be available if you have any additional questions. Please join us in 30 minutes for our next session, Community-Driven Solutions. Thank you.